Hello, everyone. Welcome. You know, it happens every single time, and I never get tired of it. Just the act of standing at a podium, how it just starts to quiet the room. So I always get a big kick out of it. Thanks. Thanks for indulging me. As you know, we're kicking off the critical studies semester for the spring semester tonight. The first lecture this evening, discussion groups following, and then another lecture happening a little later in the semester. You know, of course, sorry, there's a little awkward step here. You know that the fellowship brings an outside scholar to Cranbrook, so many of you were with Francis Halsall last year and Anthony Burt, and of course all of us got to meet Joseph Tanke last semester. We always look for someone who's going to be sharing their research as a way for us to shake up our thinking and start to get perspectives, networks, contacts outside of our own community. You know, of course, that while our fellows are in residence, they'll visit you in your studios, they'll attend crits. We'll have formal moments like this when we're convening for a lecture, and medium formal moments when we're around the library conference room. Some of you have already met our new fellow, Jaimey Hamilton Faris, upstairs in the reception in the library. And then, of course, you'll have time to meet Jaimey over the coming days and the coming weeks. And as you know, a lot of the way this program works really relies on you making the invitation and reaching out and seeking her out, so I encourage you to do that. Please do take time to invite her to the departments. That can be for formal times, informal times. You know very well what it is to join an intense community like ours and how it can be a little bit intimidating at first, so if you'll help her integrate, that would be wonderful. Jaimey comes to us from the University of Hawai'i Mānoa, where she's an associate professor of contemporary art and critical theory. And as Jaimey's actually been in the Midwest for the last semester. She's on a full sabbatical this year, so it's true that she didn't come straight from Hawaii, although I think given the weather of the last few days, she's probably just as happy that she stopped in the Midwest instead of continuing, but I know the culture shock isn't quite as extreme as it might have been otherwise. Jaimey Hamilton Faris's writing and her research focuses on issues of globalization and what she calls translocal ethics in contemporary art. She publishes on these subjects and others in publications such as Art Journal, in October, in Invisible Culture, and also through essays and collections that are published by the Center Pompidou and Oxford University Press. She's assigned some readings, of course, for the discussion groups, but you're very welcome to look more into her own writings as well as part of that bibliography. In her recent book, Uncommon Goods, Gullible Dimensions for the Ready-Made, Jaimey explores the use of commodity objects in contemporary art practice, and as I imagine how her ideas will resonate with your studios, this is one of the points I can really see some intersections. Her research is also devoted to supporting local and international recognition for the vibrant contemporary art scene in Hawaii. She's currently completing a collection of interviews featuring artists from Hawaii who make work in response to globalization. And she also curates local and regional shows. She founded Off Hours, a pop culture space devoted to the community arts activities in Honolulu, and writes criticism for local art papers. So very integrated to her own local community, as well as having a national and international lens in her thinking. One of the benefits of having critical studies fellows from near and from farther away is that they bring their communities, their geographies, their thinking from places far outside of what we might be looking at in our immediate horizons. And in that, I think they really help us break out of the conventions of our thinking or the access points that we know very well. While at Cranbrook, Jaimey will be working on a series of essays entitled Of Islands and the In-Between, in which she discusses the importance of contemporary art about islands, straits, and oceans as what she calls useful geopoetic imaginaries of both the possible and the impossible conditions of global coexistence in the 21st century. And in this, she's asking us to consider what is the artist or designer's responsibility addressing the Earth's materiality through their chosen medium of expression. And to this end, Jaimey will be focusing the reading groups around questions of material and subjective relations within our current global economic system. So you'll see these ideas borne out, of course, through the discussions, through the readings, and then how they start to resonate in your own practices. She starts her time at Cranbrook really right away. Jaimey just arrived about 2 days ago. Her first lecture tonight, obviously, and then immediately jumping into discussion groups tomorrow afternoon. If you haven't already signed up to join one, please do sign up, or at least make sure that you show up so that you have that time with Jaimey as well. It's late January, and I know that many of you have been far and wide in travel, so it's really nice to start to kind of get centered and get back here. It's good to have you back and good to see you. Jaimey, welcome. We're really looking forward to the combination of your ideas and the work happening in the studios, and we're very glad to have you here. So, welcome.
This step is for me. Can everyone hear me in the back? Okay. So many thanks to Tricia and Sarah who've smoothed the way for my arrival. I'm honored to be here, and I want to thank everyone for the amazing generosity they've shown so far, and I look forward to being part of the community. I'd like to start by acknowledging the seeming irony of choosing to talk about islands and oceans in the middle of a continental landmass. Hawaii seems far away right now, and everyone I've met who's seen my rainbow driver's license asks, why would I possibly choose to leave Hawaii for Detroit, especially in the middle of winter? My response, especially on a day like today, is that what's not to like about these brilliant, crisp, blue-skied winter days. But I'm also thinking in the back of my mind, Hawaii is not actually so different from this place in many respects. We have Costco. We have poverty and extreme wealth existing side by side. Hawaii has always loomed large in the global imaginary as an island mecca. Detroit currently has a hold on the art world imaginary as an emerging creative mecca. In other words, I'm interested in thinking not just about Hawaii, but also about Detroit as part of what I will introduce tonight as the repeating island. Tonight, though, I won't talk so much about specific islands as about the idea of islands, the geopoetics of islands as useful imaginaries for thinking about art's relationship to the world, our relationship to the world, and the world's relationship to itself and the cosmos. I was playing this random story generator game with my 5-year-old niece last week, and this is what she came up with. It seems so appropriate for what I want to do here tonight, to tell you some silly and some serious stories about islands that talk and islands that move, and potentially move us towards understanding both our immersion in the world and our difference from it. I'd like to approach this tonight in 3 parts, starting with a general introduction of how my critical and aesthetic approach for the book of Islands in the In-Between, which I'm just beginning, is developing what I am calling nezo-aesthetics. I'll move then to discussing how nezo-aesthetics engages our recurring nesomanias, the ceaseless human desire for new and better utopias, you might say, for New Earth to territorialize our repeating islands. I'll then talk a little bit about some particular artworks I find useful in articulating how nezo-aesthetics seeks to overcome representations of human conflict via localized explorations of the world, its matter, and its mattering. First, what is nezo-aesthetics? How are islands useful in thinking even generally about art's relationship to the world? Nezo-aesthetics has developed from my materialist approach to art in general. I take the position that aesthetics is first of all an exploration of our sensible experience, a pursuit of articulating the material and the affective properties of art, an exploration of the ways in which art itself opens up our sensible experience of the world. That is, I view art as an important practice of creating or inventing new spaces of possibility and new sensations. Our experiences of the world and of art at their most transformative are not only semiotic, but kinesthetic, material, active, multiplicitous events, moments of intensity that provide a destabilizing relationship with the world, access to what we do not know about it and each other. I also consider art apart from and a part of the world. In many ways, to make a quick and dirty metaphor here, art is like an island. It is its own entity, apart one word but meaning separation, but also apart, two words but meaning conjunction, of the unfolding experiences we have of the world and interpretations we make of the world. This is a quick and evocative description of a specifically feminist and materialist notion of the aesthetic experience as part of a larger ecology of meaning and imagination. Art is necessarily and inextricably part of ethics, history, politics, economics, geology, and so on. And as Donna Haraway, the radical feminist, cyber-feminist, puts it, and this is on the screen right here, it matters what matters we use to think other matters. And this, to me, is the kind of essence of art making and aesthetics. I've explored this kind of aesthetics with respect to ready-mades in my previous book on common goods. And while writing that book, I found the recurring theme of islands in the thinking of my favorite theorists, Edouard Glissant, Rosie Berdati, Donna Haraway, Gilles Deleuze, often with collaborator Felix Guattari. Deleuze's theories, in fact, undergird many of the more contemporary thinkers, and he often discussed our ethico-aesthetic relationships using geologic, tectonic, and island concepts. In What is Philosophy, he and Guattari offer what they call geophilosophy. Thinking and feeling always takes place in relationship to the earth. His famous essay, Desert Islands, is a critique of Western subjectivity's foundational mythology of origin and difference. And I found one of his most evocative concepts of the creative process in his essay on Herman Melville. He says, "It is first of all the affirmation of a world in process, an archipelago, not even a puzzle, whose pieces, when fitted together, would constitute a whole, but rather a wall of loose, uncemented stones, where every element has a value in itself, but also in relation to others. Isolated and floating relations, islands and straits, immobile points and sinuous lines, for truth always has had jagged edges." We'll get to Melville and the white whale in a few months when I talk about oceans. But what I want to draw your attention to now is what Deleuze describes here as a concrete pursuit of making sensible human world situations. He's asking us not to perceive the world in shifting parts, or not only to perceive the world in shifting parts, but to be sensible to the world's own agency, its forces, its process, in so many words, its ability to talk. One could think about the aesthetic experience in this way, as a block of sensations, operating between the so-called object and viewer, opening this arbitrary division that we've made between subject and object, opening the self to a world of impermanence and interpenetration, a molecular and geologic world of becoming. And somewhat Deleuze offers is a materialist understanding of relations applicable to both the world and our representations of it. And this is what I'm calling neso-aesthetics, and that derives from the Greek nesos. So to test and generate my understanding of this concept, I've been exploring the work of a number of artists who are specifically concerned with contemporary representations of the world as archipelago. Take Turkish artist Emre Huner, for instance. I first saw Huner's work at the New Museum Triennial Younger for Jesus and ended up inviting him to Hawaii. I run a similar program to this in Hawaii. And I first saw, and since since he's visited, we've both been obsessed with islands, and we've exchanged readings and sharing work. And I'm showing you here part of a recent project, Aeolian Processes, and that's a reference to the way that wind shapes land. And in this series, Huner revels in the properties of clay and his own ability and inability to shape it. In the end, he creates forms that we cannot readily understand and are vaguely geologic. Huner's strange arrangements of unfired clay bodies articulate their powdery textures, their particle mashing, and their inability to stay amassed. He challenges my meaningful world by presenting these fragments not as human artifact, but as the world's vital material. Huner's work makes me attentive to the specific textures and things in the world and their object quality to resist my words and my logic. Usually these maquettes and props are also shown in animation and projection, and this further emphasizes their agency beyond an easy understanding of what they are. He's also working on this series. These are sketches in clay and drawing for his new series called Perpetual Island Infinite Vehicle, which will be in the Istanbul Biennial. This is a drawing of this as well, of these sketches. They mediate on our perpetual innovation, our love of imagining new solutions, even as we leave behind us in the wake abandoned ruins. And these pieces are based on Christopher Priest's future dystopia, The Islanders. This is something that he and I have read, Hunar and I have read together. And also, if you guys are interested in this, this is a fun read as well. Judith Stroboski's Atlas of Remote Islands, 50 Islands I Have Never Set Foot On and Never Will. It's a hilarious dystopic look at islands around the world. And these have inspired Hunar to offer both a critique of the typical mythology of island utopias and also present more evocative and open-ended sedimentations that could invite us to see these fragments of the world differently. Take also a very different kind of project. This is a multimedia and web-based design project called Smudge, founded by Elizabeth Ellsworth, professor of media at the New School, and Jamie Cruz, a designer affiliated with Parsons. This is a book cover that they designed. And the book is a collection of essays called Making the Geologic Now, Responses to Material Conditions of Contemporary Life. In 2006, they developed an online studio in order to generate a community around current geologic conditions of the Anthropocene. And this did not work. Let's see if I can get, there we go. This is their website, Smudge Studios, and they've done various projects. This is a project from 2014 called For Future North, Inhabiting Change and Churning at the Limits of the World. And I like this piece because it's very simple, and it's essentially a conceptual score indebted to Fluxus event scores, in which participants could construct their own experiences of meeting at the edge and having to churn from it. So they start with make a deliberate intention to meet forces that compose a limit of the world, and then set a practice for that, for meeting that limit. And then eventually to perform the churn, what they call perform the churn. And they say, quote, to churn is to acknowledge a limit and live by that limit, but with a generative difference. So this is a completely different materiality, a completely different artwork than Hunar, but I think also exhibiting some of the same characteristics. I'm deeply interested in the poetic irresolution of such works as Hunar and Smudge, the way they offer the world in jagged relation. Both engage different kinds of materials, different immersions in the geologic, and that, to my mind, are in beautiful dialogue with Deleuze's diagram. And I would like to proffer them as useful cartographies of belonging, maps, so to speak, that keep us on the move by offering dynamic and ongoing ecologies of earth, politics, and subjectivity, maps that help us better understand parts as they relate to the whole. Together, these images and words in process and in relation have guided me towards questions that I think would and should concern us all. What is the power of matter in relationship to us? How does it affect us? How does it move us? And what I mean by matter is, of course, the Earth's matter, subatomic matter, cosmic matter, but also more mundanely, the materials that artists use, necessarily derived from that same stuff. Putting these two questions together, we can then broach two more questions. How do our confrontations with representation as medium, material, and materiality open us up to new relations with the world? How does art activate larger tectonic worlding processes, of asking how and why, or really, do we matter? So, moving on to part 2, how to apply this Nezo-aesthetics to our current geopolitical situations. Archipelagic cartography abounds in the art world lately. Understandably, it is tied to an ethics and politics of global land development, appropriation, resource extraction, and global warming. For instance, Nicholas Schaffhausen, director of the Kunsthalle Wien, led a colloquium for artists and designers at the Fogo Island Institute a few years ago, in which he asked, quote, whether islands can still be said to exist, or whether they have been subsumed into the broader global imaginary landmass through increased flows of communication, connectivity, corporatism, and travel. Is this a new Pangea, he asked, or has globalization made us all, islanders, metropolitans, and everyone in between, insular? This underlying problematic of the world as archipelago has also been identified by Territorial Agency, a collaboration of architects and urbanists who work with partners worldwide. Perhaps their most extensive project to date is North, and I'm showing you an image from the North project here, which brings visibility to the recent geopolitical issues arising in the Arctic Circle. This is a cold, icy region with waterways that give important shipping access to Russia, China, Northern Europe, the US, and Canada. And it's filled with small island groups and ice caps that are indeterminately qualify as islands, at least until they melt. And for part of the project, Territorial Agency collaborated with Professor Aaron Levy at the University of Pennsylvania to design an exhibition for the Slot Foundation. They began by collecting and constructing a series of archives and materials representative of the various fields of influence currently operating in the North. And what they found was an ever-shifting geography, both literally and informationally. As ice melts, there's new access to oil through fracking. Countries around the Arctic Circle have begun to make claims on what has traditionally been commons, a global commons. And with radar, gravitational measurement satellites, multispectral imaging, radiomagnetic measurements, and the like, these countries can now qualify, regulate, and legislate this remote area. Russians have launched a submarine in order to claim the bottom of the ocean, and Canada has opened a new military base. So what Territorial Agency does, and did in the Slot Foundation exercise, was ask its collaborators to use the internet to archive these activities the best they can, building a paradoxically deterritorialized and fragmented record of this new crisis of the ocean's territorialization. It is to this confusing network of data to which Territorial Agency wants to draw our attention. And not surprisingly, they articulate their suspicions in terms of the archipelago. They say the archipelago is a spatial device for differentiation, separation, and control of flows and trajectories that cross it and pass through its meandering spaces. It separates languages, nationalities, routes, commerces, environments, and individualities. The archipelago is transformed into a system of immunity from the local and global controversies and conflicts that operate across a scattered geography of its many seas and islands. Together, Schaffhausen and Territorial Agency highlight the problem of islands as a geopolitical trope. They insinuate that we are experiencing the world more and more as increasingly conflicting sovereignties brought on by national pursuits of private property and resource extraction. And then they add another layer, which is to indicate that our seemingly omnipresent systems, the global as a systemic info-material archipelago, if you will, is reinforcing our non-knowledge of this process. In some, islands have become an important way to represent the major current contradiction of our age. At one level, our knowledge of the world and our ability to access it seems unbounded, and on another level, because our actual fragmented and distracted use of such access, we create our worlds in isolation from others, blind to how our actions detrimentally affect other parts of the world and the world's futures, all of which seems very distant, but is actually very imminent. This is brilliantly summed up in Dubai's World Islands, a massive offshore development project begun in 2003 that I'm showing here, and it was halted due to financial difficulty and is now sinking back into the bay. And I'm pairing it here with one of Andrea Zitel's A to Z design parodies of our quest for private utopias, a perfect counter to this kind of territorialization of the ocean. These little islands are built to artificial perfection and then just as quickly deserted. Our inability to be attentive to these differing scales of assuming that the world fits snugly together in some sort of parceled out puzzle is what we might consider a fundamental characteristic of nesomania. Nesomania literally means a mania for islands, but it's also part of a general fantasy that the world is ours for the taking, that the earth is a passive and inexhaustible resource, and that with each new discovery of a locale, we can escape the problems we've created elsewhere and begin anew. I've been showing you recent examples of the phenomenon of, in terms of global development. And in order to bring us to the Caribbean here, I'm showing you another example from Eora and Calzadia's work, part of their Landmarks project, in which they organized a protest against the U.S. military installation on the island of Vieques, Puerto Rico. And in this project, participants made their rubber soles into protest stamps and then marched on the forbidden beach, and that's the document that you're seeing here. I'd like to take a minute to sketch out the importance of colonial and imperial history in this drive towards nesomania. It's what Caribbean historian Antonio Benítez-Rojo, who himself was informed by Deleuzean imagery, called the repeating island. In his book on the history of the Caribbean, Benítez-Rojo had articulated the ways in which, despite the distinctiveness of each island's history of first contact and colonization, they had all, in the Caribbean, but this also pertains to the Pacific and many other places as well, they all had repeating patterns of discovery, recurring waves of military fleets, missionaries, explorers, and bureaucrats who set up systems of resource extraction, followed by the relentless machinery of plantation and cash crop systems, in which the island's resources were eventually stripped and exported by natives, slaves, and indentured workers. Benítez-Rojo's logic can be extended to see that colonial patterns have not disappeared, but have shifted to more contemporary systems of militarization and land appropriation. And in this sense, island localities become a useful tropism for these sorts of global local encounters. The rhythm of nesomania increasing as the crisis of territorialization comes to a head in our current moment. There's so much history I could share in this regard, and it's rather bleak, and I want to get onto a more hopeful place in this lecture. So let me just shorthand this briefly in terms of 2 or 3 famous nesomaniacs. Starting with Thomas More, who in 1516 set out to describe an exemplary republic with citizens living in harmony with no private property. He gave this ideal island the ambiguous Latinate description, a good place and no place at all. It is also part of the humanist awakening of democratic republics, in which a diversity of ideas about human nature, basic human needs, and rights were expressed. While a fantastic place in and of itself, the problem with More's utopia and utopia in general, as Aldous Huxley later allegorized in his own critique of More, is that utopias do not relate to the real, material, and constant movement of the world. As Deleuze rightly articulates, islands are apart from and a part of the world. Islands have always been connected by flows to the rest of the world, and because of this, have often become pawns in the historical drive of imperialism. And to this little allegory of the island utopia, I would just like to add to my previous discussion on aesthetics that art is also often considered a utopic no place. But I see it more like Deleuze's geologic jumble of islands, coexisting in uneasy relation to the world's other aspects. And this is just an aside, maybe we can pick up later in discussion if anyone cares to. Another nesomaniac, one closer to my home, Captain Cook, one of the imperial era's greatest explorers, who, with a lot of help from a Tahitian voyager named Tupaia, charted and claimed many of the Pacific islands for England. This is an image of Cook being greeted as a god by the Hawaiians. Cook was in many ways an enlightened individual, attuned to the immortality of simply annihilating other cultures, yet nonetheless he was a man of his time, working under the auspices of the Royal Society to chart the oceans and the stars. And under his watch, knowledge and land acquisition occurred hand in hand. Learning to speak a number of Polynesian languages, and also relying on the Pacific Island mythologies in which his sudden appearance on a massive ship would be taken as godlike, his voyages were among the most sustained and successful of the era. But his Nesomania ended tragically in so many ways. This is a heroic painting of his death by the Hawaiians, when they finally began to understand that Cook was simply a man straining the island's agricultural and political ecosystem. Dishonored by his lack of protocol, they attacked. His legacy in the Pacific has unleashed a recurring colonialist process to this day. Now the question I really wanted to get to, was how to confront this Nesomania with a Neso-aesthetics. One way is to rupture the very fabric of the Nesomaniac fantasy itself, deface the archives that preserve and uphold these narratives. This is a piece by Drew Broderick, a young Hawaiian artist who has simply and elegantly put the heroic dying posture of Cook under erasure, creating a pause in our consumption of the standard colonial history. Likewise, he emphasizes the materiality of tourist kitsch and cheap reproductions, complete with deflated palm beer cooler, which you can see down there on the floor, that now overruns the actual Hawaiian landscape. Now, I'm running quickly through examples, but what I mean to suggest is that the artists chose their media strategically. Sand, fiberglass, film, blogs, websites, paintings, and photos draw attention back to these materials as the often seamless substrates of our knowledge and representational systems. A nice, simple example of, I'm going to skip Bickerton here, even though it's so seductive, right? Just in the interest of time. A nice, simple example of an artist who creates ruptures in the Gauguinian narrative would be French artist Camille Henro's work. This is a really simple piece right here, contemporary painting project, where she's taking a copy of an art history book on modern painting and simply pasting soft porn tourist postcards of Tahitian girls, pointing to the historical redundancy of the trope. Her simple appropriative collage method was taken to new levels in Gross Fatigue, a recent video in which she presents our knowledge of the universe as an absorbing, pulsing, and ever-folding, unfolding archive. And these are just a couple of stills of that video. It's very amazing, and you should watch the clips online if you can find some time. Henro has spent much of her short career exploring the human drive to knowledge, the seductive forces of anthropology, botany, and ethnology as part of the colonial gaze. But as the haptic rhythm of the video unfolds in time, the information becomes a series of material squares, unveiling themselves incessantly, overriding each other, screen after screen. A subtler example of her technique is this 35mm film, cut delayed shot, in the Pentecost Island in the Vanuatu archipelago. And this film records a land diving ceremony of a local tribe, a rite of passage into adulthood in which the young men jump from a tall wooden structure secured by liana leaves tied around their ankles. And at first, the film that she creates seems to be a simple play with our impulses towards sensationalism, as we witness seemingly authentic old documentary footage. But in continuing to watch the film, we begin to notice its repetition. She records the dive and repeats the dive over and over again. And it seems to be obsessed with this exotic difference and the thrill of this dive. And there's also this deliberate cut along its vertical axis, so that one side is delayed a second more than the other one, setting up a subtle disruptive dysphagia in the film. And as the images move from the jumpers to the tribal members to the audience, we realize that this is a ceremony performed specifically for present-day tourists. Henro's larger agenda, as you can start to see here in the way that she conceives of the body of her work, as a world of regional island flows. She's got America, the Pacific, the Orient, Middle East, Orient, Africa, Europe. She conceives of her work as these regional island flows, and it's to get us to this point where the accumulation of her work together, and if you saw the retrospective at the New Museum, you'd see how this works. It just bombards you with the tragedy of the repeating island, looped, stuttering, and tearing into the historical naturalization of discovery and development. So what I'm arguing is that Henro's repetition of the already repeating island offers an intensity in which we can see that immense scale of human history and often human hubris in the repeated now. This is a technique particular to another of my favorite media artists, Paul Pfeifer. Pfeifer was born and raised in Hawaii and in the Philippines. And he's known, many of you have probably seen the Art 21, he's known for digitally erasing famous media icons from their arenas and looping them so that they recur like fits and seizures. This series presents 24 different digital erasures of Marilyn Monroe on the beach, and it's still, so it's just these still photographs. It's not a video loop. But when they're blown up to a larger scale, Pfeiffer's technical erasure is seamless, allowing undistracted attention to examine the strangely unfocused snapshots. The images are grainy, and they have shadows in places where the shores, waves, and sand subtly erode and wrap around a person that's no longer there. What is important to me is not so much Monroe's absence, but an understanding that someone is absent. The photos play on the typical cliched picture postcard moment in which we feign our solicitous regret. I wish you were here. The shore is no longer a backdrop for a human-centered world, but a constant tidal shift that will be there long after us, as if the earth itself was sending such a postcard back to humans now disappeared. As Pfeiffer puts it, and this is a quote from an interview, it's not invention, it's not technology, it's not movement to new places that will resolve basic human world tensions. Islands can teach us the visible limits of the here and now. At the same time, they express a certain elegiac understanding that it may be too late, that we have already erased ourselves from existence. This is an important point that he makes. Islands may not seem, or they may seem to be simply and simple exemplary representations of the most horrific problems of our age, fights over land rights, abuses of nature's resources, and ultimately the submersion of land and the creation of landless citizens, as in the case in the Maldives. And this was highlighted in the Maldives Pavilion, a new feature in the Venice Biennale this year. But islands also, and Pfeiffer's work also in its repetition of this, creates a future past tense, a looping on itself that moves us to view these problems from a geologic scale. Or to put it another way, Pfeiffer's series of rather quiet, oblique, fuzzy landscapes address the age-old question, is art's role to make visible the sad results of these ravaged post-colonial and now globalized contexts? Does art need to simply provide cautionary tales? Or can its aesthetic pause be enough to engage and be instrumental in addressing the history of human conflict? This is an irresolvable question, and one that will probably come up a lot in discussion. But my sense is that art's most powerful role is to attempt to create enough of a pause that it ungrounds us from proliferating representations of difference, ownership, exclusion, and redrawn boundaries that we see every day. So if it can create that pause and kind of quiet our senses and ourself, then it's somehow successful. And this is where Pfeiffer's landscapes are important to me. They are not imaginary recoveries of his Filipino homeland. They are expressions of the recurring waves brought on by the Earth's gravity that erase our footprints as we walk. And with this gesture, bring a renewed gravity to the human claims of ever-shifting sands. His landscapes, especially in relation to the history of the landscape tradition, offer an instant in which the constant litany of challenges to whose land, whose resources, whose culture is refocused or put out of focus so that we can shift focus to the shore as a limit, a place of churning. He takes the Earth's matter, which has been excluded from mattering in our cosmopolitan world, and makes it a subjective force, humbling human conflict and political interest in the face of an ecological time frame. And this is the here and now that he speaks of, not a grand paradisical one where we consume the spectacle of the beach, but an important intensity in which we gain an appreciation for the grainy sand captured in the graininess of his appropriated photo. And this is how Pfeiffer often works with repetition in the loop, to create an intensity, a rich, luscious, yet kind of uncomfortable pulsing image in which our mediated notions of quick, instantaneous access to the world can be restructured. And lately he's been working on videos of violent life cycles of queen bees as allegories to our own imperial ambitions. And he's filmed these bees using his friend's beehive on the Big Island. And so there is a lot of resonance to this dialogue with islands in this particular piece. But I think it more expedient to simply point to an older work here before we move on. And this is After the Deluge, another elegiac video in which he filmed a 24-hour cycle of the sun rising and setting on an ever-shifting and mirrored ocean horizon. As viewers, we're positioned both in a time and place after our demise, after the deluge, and also we're placed firmly in the present, in the gallery, experiencing a beautiful but not entirely understandable moment of double sunsets bleeding into each other. So, taking liberties in the bending of human space-time I've introduced here, I want to island hop a bit to bring this talk towards a jagged-edged conclusion. Let's go back for a moment to Robert Smithson, who, looking on at this first image of the Earth as seen from the moon, saw its potential entropic chaos. He stated, "Perhaps the moon landing was one of the most demoralizing events in history, and that the media revealed the planet Earth to be a limited closed system, not unlike the island of Lord of the Flies. As the Earth, and in typical Smithsonian language, he says, as the Earth thickens with blood and waste as the population increases, the stress factor could bring the system to total frenzy." One could read Smithson as articulating even more than Pfeiffer's elegies a certain fatalism of our repeating island syndrome. Humans incessantly building the same technological utopias replete with systems of domination and violence on each new island, including island Earth, without fully understanding the failure of the last. But there's also something about Smithson's love of science fiction. As he says, remote futures meet remote pasts, that opens up what seems to be his closed system of entropy. Smithson's projects, like Pfeiffer's, initiate a process of self-aware feedback loops for me, concrete moments in which we become sensible to a world in both composition and decomposition, its own vibrations, rotations, whirlings, gravitations, and understand finally that we are part of this chaotic becoming. So let's now hop forward to the planet Omnium. This landscape, framed and fictionalized by artist and filmmaker Rosa Barba, seems to be the next logical iteration of Smithson's vision. Barba, by the way, is an Italian, contemporary Italian filmmaker living in Berlin, and she's an avid Smithsonian to the core. And this is especially evident in her sensuous, grainy film stock, the way she uses disruptive jump cuts, the whirring noises that she uses, and also the science fictional speculation as the basis of her storytelling. So this image is part of a slow, it's just a still that's part of a slow pan across a bleak, snowy, abandoned industrial site. And we're told by a narrator in the film that the humans have denuded the landscape and disappeared from this planet, indicating that it's yet another failed human future past on other islands further and further afield. So now we're looking at planet islands instead of islands on the Earth. But the actual footage for this alien planet was taken at the Land Supplementation Project for the new port in Rotterdam. So many of Barbara's projects have revolved around land development conflicts in the North. But in contrast to the informational archipelago that Territorial Agency builds, she creates rather fabulous, even edging on ridiculous, scenarios in which we encounter the problematics of the North as both at both the discursive and the ground level. This is an island composed of fragmented and incongruous shorelines for her web-based project sponsored by DIA, and it's online, and I can share the link with you after the lecture, but I don't want to waste time kind of exploring it with you right now. And instead, I just brought this little film still, a still from one of the films and one of the fragments of the website. And what she does is hyperlink parts of the island with different fragments of film and different narratives to compose fragments of a story about a fictional city north of the Arctic Circle, which must be relocated due to ground instability caused by massive mining in the area. And it's based on a real place, the city of Kiruna in the Swedish Lapland. And what Barbara does is use real historical records to create her fictional scenario. And this unfolds in a complicated conspiratorial tale in which the mining company tries to distract the people of the town from their own culpability by sponsoring legislation to change the system of driving from the left side of the road to the right side of the road. So this is a clip of a newscaster kind of presenting the results of the first day when this switch happens, saying that everything is normal, don't worry. And this is a fragment of the website and the narrative and the selection of stills that you would have, or the films that you would have access to. So it's totally serious, but with elements of dark humor that allegorize our incapacity to understand and resolve the complex and intertwined political, economic, ecological, and subjective ecologies of our life world. In other words, Barbara likes to jump around in time to tell tales of our insular logic. This is a persistent theme in her work, and what I deeply appreciate is that she doesn't present these seemingly cautionary tales as human-to-human conflict or simply a critique of capitalism and globalization, though they're obviously there. She presents it as a human Earth problem. The uncanny humor in her work derives from the fact that her human actors, often locals to the places that she's filming, are very identifiable, but nevertheless completely clueless about the grander scale of the Earth. Their strange human designs miss the beauty and the humming of the Earth that is so obvious to the audience that's watching the films on a large screen. Thanks in part to her very material use of the film projector and her sound design, the Earth does seem to vibrate, exhibiting an energy and a whir that does not impede the design of human agency so much as drift away from it. And this is exactly what happens in Outwardly from Earth's Center, another of Barbara's science fictional documentaries filmed with the help of the inhabitants of Goskasanden, an island off the coast of Sweden. The film begins with the residents relating a problem to the filmmaker documentary style. Their island seems to be drifting slowly northwards, though its directional drift seems hard to capture by the experts. The geologist shows us the lines of force coming from all directions on a projected screen, and this is a film still of that screen. And it's not at all clear why the island is moving, though the archivist of the town proposes one entertaining theory that a conspiracy of pirates centuries ago untied the ropes that anchored the islands to the bottom of the ocean. And the residents go about trying to re-anchor the island. They attach ropes to the island's trees and pull it from its center outwardly in multiple directions. And as the film progresses, the point of view shots are no longer attached to the residents and the filmmaker. And in this way, she unhinges it from human agency and starts filming the activities as if humans are the strangers. And in this way, I get the sense that the island itself is peeking at the absurd earthwork created by the islanders. The film ends with an aerial view of the island in which a mesh of lines can be seen crisscrossing its edges and out into the ocean. And this mesh is not composed of simple longitudinal, latitudinal lines of the territorial map. Instead, they are lines that better represent the island's slow, almost imperceptible movement relative to our rates of change. Its endurance, its time, not our time, its outward, onward thrust. So in the film, Barbara first poses the movement of the islands as a problem for the human inhabitants, but ends with a larger frame of the beautiful map of a world in process, which reminds us of a very important fundamental geologic fact. Islands move and grow as well as sink, moving islands. And I'm just gonna skip this in the interest of time, even though it's super fascinating. Moving islands. Taking this concept back to the geologic and Deleuze's diagram of the world as archipelago, it might be interesting to think through Barbara's simple point. Not because of humans do islands move, but by virtue of the boiling mantle at the Earth's center that shifts the outer crust and creates new land. Islands, in other words, are submarine rhizomes, and this is how Edward Glissant talks about islands as rhizomes and rhizomatic. I've been hinting thus far that anezoaesthetics is about seeing parts in relation to the whole, but what I really mean to get at is that islands as rhizomes are endless growing points in an ever-evolving earth. They relate to each other in the earth as a moving rootedness, not as a rootless, isolated drifting. And it follows that perhaps our position in relation to it, especially because the world is ever more connected and fragmented, should also be necessarily rhizomatic. Now, I'm not advocating here for the condition of global nomadism, but rather a conscious rooted rootlessness, as art critic Manthia Diawara recently argued in the Pages of Art Forum in his beautiful review of Kedar Attias' work, and I'm just showing you the image reference here for him, which is these cities built out of couscous. By way of a gloss on Edward Glissant's Poetics of Relation, he talks about contemporary art practices that keep us in place, mindful of the importance and sustenance of the locality in which we are embedded, but that also simultaneously ungrounds us from concepts of exclusive dominion. What Diawara, Glissant, and all of the materialist philosophers that I've discussed tonight propose is difficult. This concept of the rhizome and unrooting. It's very difficult to think about that in relationship to our privatized lives and our drive towards territorialization and the repeating island. But I think it's a proposal that we're forced to be more attentive to, given the very fact of our limited Earth island. So let me jump just one last time here to one last island. This is Oahu, to articulate this concept of the rhizome. This is the work of Eating in Public, begun by Gay Chan and Nandita Sharma, and their media of choice is not only photography and signage, but the earth itself. Along with other artists and activist groups around the world, they strategically cultivate the global commons and consider their activities as continuing a tradition of the diggers and the levelers of 17th century England, who occupied a small area of common land in protest to the first Enclosure Acts. As a counterpoint, and this was a counterpoint to the property-based liberalism of Hobbes and Locke, the diggers claimed self-government and communities of mutual collaboration and contestation. And what Chan and Sharma do is help to revive digging as a community relational art form. Part of eating in public's practice has been to plant in plots near where they live and work that have suffered neglect because the land is indeterminately owned, neither claimed nor used by private estates or cities. Some of their first commons work were illicit papaya gardens planted in strips of land outside school fences and near neighborhood sidewalks. Eating in public's notion of the commons is like the spread of rhizomes, common spaces wedging themselves in the cracks of private and public property. The goal is that common space will propagate more common space, that it will generate new systems for water, seed, and food culture. As a relational practice, it operates by doing, but I see it connected to and complement to the more gallery-oriented work I've been discussing and I've been showing, because I don't think it proposes to resolve the human conflict of land appropriation, but instead it creates, like the art in the gallery, an effective moment in which participants dig, and in doing so directs the typical experience of land as property to one of land as vital materiality. And I just have to quickly point out that this is an especially charged project in the context of Hawaii, where native epistemologies of habitation, including the ahupua'a, the wedge-shaped areas of land on each of the islands that are divided from the interior mountain peaks to the ocean, and provided the microsystem of natural resources in pre-contact Hawaii. These have all but been destroyed by the history of post-contact land appropriation and privatization, and are now inexorably connected to a global development system. EIP, eating in public, operating within this global archipelagic system, offers the counter-rhizomatic properties of the commons, islands of earth sprouting within the present system of private property, emphasizing fragmented, unstable, moving ground in which no position is final. And I find it important that eating in public, like all of the art I've been talking about tonight, celebrates a moment in which we relate to each other through the earth, outside of the political structures that simply demand resolution. It is a moment in which we begin to understand that resolution is actually a rather fallible human concept. As Deleuze reminds us, truth always has jagged edges. Art offers respite in which we can pay attention to our own interfacing with each other and the earth as moments of becoming instead of moments of possessing. Practices like eating in public and films like Barbara's, though radically different in medium, allow us to exist in a profoundly decentered position, and at the same time offer us sensuous moments in which we practice our capacity to engage, to care for, to find pleasure in, and to be enmeshed in the world. They offer us a language of worlding, of being immersed in the matter and the matters of the world. And to my mind, at this epic historic moment, what could be more important than making our worlding process more perceptible and sensible in its awesome, manifold, architectonic structure? Thank you. So I know I showed a lot of images and went through things rather fast. And this is a work in progress, so I would be happy to take questions and start a conversation. Yeah.
I guess I'm just curious. I mean, I think maybe the answer to my question is sort of obvious, but it was towards the end of your lecture that you started to talk about practices that are not the gallery practice or the singular object practice as different, and but having something shared with the gallery or the singular object practice. It doesn't seem. I'm thinking about the artists that you chose, and I know that you're linking them conceptually to the metaphor and the reality of the island condition, but I'm also wondering, it's probably not inconsequential to you that these are practices that are non-object based in a certain way, and they do break out of a commodity
Mm-hmm.
If that's true,
I think it's not true that they break out of that commodity system. I think all of the art, including eating in public, exists within a commodity system. They eating in public tries to barter most of its wares, but eating in public is also an artist and a sociologist that make their living going to lectures and that the like, and so participate in that way in the commodity system. And what I'm trying to do is, and I knew this was provocative to choose such wide-ranging examples, and I wanted to do that purposely just to generate some discussion around the possibilities of materiality and the possibilities of the aesthetic moment, the importance of the aesthetic moment in the gallery and in relational art practice, often in combination. Critics and artists often kind of find themselves in camps where to do and to be practical and to, be more politically motivated separates them necessarily from a gallery practice. And I think that's not the reality of the situation. And I think those effective moments can be found in both situations, and not singularly either. What I was trying to articulate tonight is that these moments also have an accumulative effect. That you can see pieces like Barbas, you can see films like Barbas, or go to the retrospective of Camille Henro's work and be moved by the way that they use the materiality of film in their work to, in Henro's case, critique anthropological styles of filmmaking and the anthropological project in general, and then also be moved in a different way with a relational practice project like eating in public. And it's in the combination of those things, in our own real-time experience as viewers and human beings, that we start to put those pieces together and accumulate an experience and an understanding where we see their relationship to each other. And not just conceptually either, but I think also in terms of the sensuousness of the material that they choose to use. I think I saw another hand in the middle. No? Okay. Yes.
This may be kind of silly, but do you mind talking a little bit about the etymological lineage of Nesomania and Nesoaesthetics, sort of what that prefix means?
Well, I mean, it's derived from the Greek nesos, meaning island. So it's as simple as that. I mean, I think there are other root words that relate to that, and I would have to look that up as a kind of, I've been using it as a shorthand, so I think in discussion groups, maybe we can do some etymological rooting around and find out more. Yes? Mm-hmm.
I'm not quite sure what the problem solution is to you, or if that is.
Okay. There is no problem because there is no solution because there is no problem, as Duchamp says. Islands, each island in each history is different, right? So, and there are your imperial islands, like England, and there are urban metropolitan islands like Hong Kong and Manhattan. And then there are also the small Pacific islands and the Caribbean islands, as you point out. So there's not really, and I tried to avoid this in the lecture. I'm not trying to ascribe a singular meaning or problem to all islands. It's not about islands per se as geographic land masses that cause problems. Instead, what I'm trying to articulate is that it's our kind of, a lot of the problem kind of comes from the concept of sovereignty itself, comes from the concept of the subjective individual as having a basic human right or natural right to own land. And that a lot of the historical problems that come from Nesomania and that still recur today come from that kind of subjective position. And what I think art helps us do is not necessarily abandon that subjective position, because I think we are deeply rooted in that system right now. But it ungrounds us a bit to understand through a wider lens that maybe that's not the only position we can take in relationship to the earth, or in relationship to islands. And I don't know how to be more specific to your question, because I'm trying not to be specific to the question. But I think what you're trying to articulate are the kinds of problematics that exist on Hawaii, in Hawaii, for instance, on Oahu. And that last example with eating in public, I think is very close to my heart, and I can talk to you a bit more about what I have seen in the art scene in Honolulu and on Oahu in terms of artists trying to deal with the history of land appropriation and land development, and the way that they see their art participating in that. Because it can't solve problems. Art is a representational practice, but it can create incursions into that representational system. And eating in public is an important practice that does this, but there's a photographer who I really admire who has another project that's also really important to this conversation, which we can talk about during our seminars. So I think in short, I am interested in those particular problems that you are also interested in, but I'm trying to resist identifying with those particular politicized problems so that we can see the larger picture. And maybe some deeper questions about not islands as the problem, but about our own approach to the earth as something that we should pay more attention to. Yes.
I don't know if this is a question or observation, but I'm curious whether this huge idea of global warming has a kind of flattening effect on some of the politics that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious how that idea plays into your discussion. Or is it something that people are talking about?
It is something that people are. Well, I mean, it comes up in two of the projects that I mentioned: Territorial Agency and Smudge. And the way that Territorial Agency approaches it is in these very dense quotes that I was reading tonight. But they address it as kind of similarly to the way that you're addressing it now, which is that it seems to be flattened by the proliferation of kind of fear and a lot of information, yet no information. And they see that as part of that network of information that kind of keeps us blind to certain things that we can practically do or not do, or maybe just initiate different relationships with each other and the earth. So they're looking at that information. They're looking at the way that global warming has been represented by nations, by different advocacy groups and things like that, and they're looking at the structure of that information. So that's kind of how I'm dealing with it as well. But I think it really is, as you have identified it, a problem that's too diffuse to really get a grasp on. So maybe we can talk more about it. Okay. I think that might be it. Okay, thank you very much.